One might very well argue that Kabbalah has become the official theology of Judaism. Concepts like the divine presence in the form of the feminine Shekhinah, the idea that the Olam, or cosmos, was created through an act of divine contraction, or tzimtzum, the goal of social and cosmic justice in the form of Tikkun Olam, the concept of reincarnation as captured by Gilgul, and of course the idea of the 10 emanations of God in the form of the Sephirot, are all core ideas to be found in the arsenal of Jewish metaphysics. Kabbalah has also become one of the foundational pillars of Western esotericism more generally. From Johannes Reuchlin to Israel Regardie, concepts from the Kabbalah have decisively transformed Western esoteric spirituality. Despite this enormous impact, the exact origins of the Kabbalah remain very mysterious. In this first episode of at least a two-part series here at Esoterica, we're going to explore some of the major texts and figures of this earlier strata of the Kabbalah. Specifically, we'll be focusing on the period after the dominance of the Merkava Hechalot literature along with the Sefer Yetzirah, but before the publication of the monumental tome, the Sefer Zohar. And it's here, in medieval southern France and Spain, that we'll find the dynamic matrix of mystical speculations out of which the Kabbalah as we know it emerged. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. While it is unsurprising that the term Kabbalah has become broadly synonymous with Jewish mysticism, this is in some ways unfortunate. This simultaneously effaces forms of Jewish mysticism which existed prior to the rise of the Kabbalah in the European Middle Ages, and also flattens out many of the real disagreements within Kabbalah itself. In fact, the idea of the Kabbalah quickly collapses if one investigates the matter very deeply. There are simply several competing, mutually exclusive schools of Kabbalah. There simply is not now, and there never has been, the Kabbalah. Of course, there were several forms of Jewish mysticism prior to the rise of the Kabbalah. This would include the Merkava mysticism, or chariot mysticism, in which one attempts to descend into the throne of God. Further, there's a Sar Torah mysticism, in which one summons an angel in order to learn rabbinic lore. In addition, there's the cosmogenic speculations of the Sefer Yetzirah, in which the Olam, or reality, is said to have emerged from 10 ontomathematical principles along with the Hebrew alphabet. If you're interested in those pre-Kabbalistic Jewish forms of mysticism, take a look at the card above. It'll include a link to our various episodes on Kabbalah. There I cover Merkava, Sar Torah, and the Sefer Yetzirah in various episodes. So if you're interested in those forms of mysticism, check out this card. While these forms of spirituality would eventually be taken up into Jewish mysticism more generally, they are, strictly speaking, prior to the rise of the Kabbalah. So what do I mean specifically by Kabbalah in this context? Here I'm restricting the use of that term to refer specifically to mystical speculations that began to arise in southern France and Spain in the Middle Ages, specifically beginning around the appearance of the Sefer Bahir, or the Book of Illumination, and culminating in the Sefer Zohar, or the Book of Radiance. So this would put us sometime around the beginning of the 12th century all the way to the 13th century. Typically we think that the Sefer Zohar was published sometime around 1270 to 1280. And it is to this early and rather mysterious time period that we begin our exploration of the early Kabbalah. Of course, by bracketing some material in this episode and some material out, careful students of the history of Kabbalah will notice a couple of things missing. First, of course, the Sefer Zohar will get at least a couple of episodes on its own, and we'll also have to cover the Chasdei Ashkenaz, or German Pietist movement, on its own as well. Further, both the developments in Jewish magic and the rise of a new form of ecstatic prophetic Kabbalah as developed by Abraham Abulafia will also be the subject of future episodes as well. So it's here that we turn our attention to the developments in theosophical speculation that laid the groundwork for the ideas to be found in the Zohar, and in a real way, by extension, the entirety of the Kabbalah itself. One of the major intellectual backdrops in the development of the Kabbalah is the impact made on the Jewish world by the rise of the more rationalistic philosophy of Maimonides. In his philosophy, the Bible and Judaism more generally should be best understood through the lens of Islamic and Aristotelian philosophy. Therefore, things like angels and demons become something basically like metaphors. Ma'aseh Bereshit, or the performance of creation, becomes synonymous with Aristotle's physics, and Ma'aseh Merkava traditionally a form of mysticism, becomes synonymous with Aristotle's metaphysics. Indeed, there's good reason to believe that the more rationalistic aspects of Maimonides' philosophy might themselves be a response to movements within Jewish mysticism itself. Rather than explaining the depths of Jewish mysticism, one might argue that Maimonides simply explained it away. Given the influence of the Great Eagle, Maimonides is sometimes referred to as the Great Eagle, and this name is just too metal not to use as much as possible, it's not surprising to learn that many of the earliest Kabbalistic texts are going to look like some kind of combination of mysticism, philosophy, and medieval science. For instance, in an early mystical school that was parallel to the movement of the Chashti Ashkenaz, or German Pietist movement, this group is often referred to as the Special or Unique Cherub Circle. This HaKeruv HaMayuchad, or Unique Cherub, plays a decisive role in their metaphysics. The Unique Cherub Circle tries to solve a basically perennial question in theosophy. How does one bridge the gap between an infinite divine realm and a finite realm of creation? The answer, as much as it is an answer, if you've ever studied any Neoplatonism, is to begin to fill that gap with an ever-growing amount of ontological intermediaries. The solution of the Unique Cherub Circle is to introduce the concept of ha'atzalah, or emanation, in which from the divine hidden realm of the inner kavod, or inner glory, the divine power flows into becoming manifest through the unique cherub, or the keruv hamiyuchad. So you can see the introduction of what appears to be a kind of Neoplatonic idea of emanation, or ha'atzalah, into the concept of Jewish metaphysics is going to be decisively important as we get into the Kabbalah. There's simply no understanding of the Sephirot without this idea of ha'atzalah, or emanation. A slightly later work, the Sefer Chachaim, is also going to employ the idea of emanation, but it's going to rely primarily on a scientific or philosophical understanding of the Sefer Yetzirah to accomplish this task. This text is somewhat interested in the idea of intermediate divine powers and even enumerates them sometimes as a kind of decad, following the ideas to be found in Sefer Yetzirah, though the text is primarily interested in the spiritual ascent of the soul into the divine world. So as we can see, by even the middle of the 12th century, some of the basic metaphysical building blocks that are going to become central in the development of the Kabbalah are already being developed. Specifically, we have the idea of emanation, or ha'atzalah, being applied at least at some level to the idea of the Sephirot to be found in the Sefer Yetzirah. And it's the combination of those two ideas that's going to be decisively important in the first real text of the Kabbalah, the Sefer Bahir, or the Book of Illumination, or Brightness. Although, despite the title of this work, it's anything other than clear. The text itself takes the form of the popular medieval midrash, a kind of running commentary on the Hebrew Bible in which the primary hermeneutics are metaphor and allegory. So here, even at the literary level, the Sefer Bahir is going to be incredibly impactful. As you probably know, the Sefer Zohar takes the exact same form typically, a kind of midrash. So even at the level of literary format, the Sefer Bahir is going to be incredibly influential in the development of the Kabbalah. Just in the same way that the Sefer Bahir is a midrash attributed to the ancient scholar Nechunya ben Hakana, in the same way the Zohar is going to be a similar kind of mystical midrash attributed to Shimon bar Yochai. So even in the form of literary format, the Sefer Bahir is incredibly influential. It sets the stage for the Sefer Zohar at the literary level. Despite being traditionally attributed to Nechunya ben Hakana, a 1st century scholar roughly contemporary with Yochanan ben Zakkai, the exact author and the geographical place of composition of this text is unclear. However, I do think that Ronit Meroz makes a very interesting argument about a possible Babylonian context for the writing of this text, based on their arguments given the Babylonian vowel notation system. However, the jury's out, and the origin of the text remains rather mysterious. As I mentioned earlier, the text is composed of about 200 short midrashim, the internal organization of which is anything other than clear. The old joke is that the writer must have taken the text, written it all out, and thrown the pages into the air, and edited them together based on how they fell. The text just makes that little sense in terms of internal organization. Despite this editorial jumble, the text does contain several important elements in the development of the Kabbalah, from explicit theosophical speculation to attempts to understand the exact nature of the composition of the Hebrew alphabet, of course another very important topic in Jewish mysticism. Perhaps the single most topic discussed for the development of the early Kabbalah in the Sefer Bahir is the idea that the 10 Sephirot originally found in the Sefer Yetzirah are in fact 10 divine emanations. While the 10 Sephirot, or the 10 Sephirot Belimah, first appear in the Sefer Yetzirah, In that text, they're not divine emanations. They're principles through which, along with the Hebrew alphabet, creation itself is produced. In fact, in that text, there's something much more like ontomathematical principles as opposed to emanations of the divine. Of course, I can't understate just how important this innovation is. The linking of the Sephirot from the Sefer Yetzirah with the idea of Ha'atzalah in a concrete way here in the Sefer Bahir is simply foundational for the kind of theosophical speculation of the Zohar and by extension of all Kabbalah itself. Further, the Sefer Bahir is the first text to explicitly link the Shekhinah, or the divine presence, with the feminine gender. While the Shekhinah appears as early as the Talmud, it's only in the Sefer Bahir that there is an explicit, concrete idea that this entity is in fact feminine. The text in fact refers to her as the Matronita. So it's here that the idea of the Shekhinah as a woman, or the feminine divine presence, is introduced, and so importantly, into the development of Kabbalah. Of course, as I'm sure you know, a great deal of later Kabbalistic speculation, especially to be found in the Zohar, has everything to do with the uniting of the masculine and feminine aspects of God. Of course, that's not possible if there aren't any feminine aspects of God, and it's here in the Sefer Bahir that we first see the idea concretely introduced into Jewish mysticism. Further, it's also worth pointing out that earlier scholars detected a kind of Gnostic influence in the Sefer Bahir's description of the Matronita, or the divine feminine presence. Specifically, she's described as an exile from the side of light, or a princess from a faraway land, and several earlier scholars have detected the idea that this may be something of an echo from the old Sophia myth to be found in some forms of Sethian Gnosticism. Though it's also possible, perhaps even likely, that some of the language around the divine Matronita is also coming from medieval romances and courtly literature. The Sefer Bahir positively abounds in allegories and metaphors about kings, queens, and their courts. And at this point in scholarship, terms like Gnostic are being used more and more sparingly with greater and greater precision. While scholars have searched for about a century and a half now for any other literary connection between the Sefer Bahir and other so-called Gnostic groups, like the Cathars, no definitive connection has been found. So the jury's out. Exactly how the Sefer Bahir comes to develop the idea of the divine Matronita remains ambiguous, mysterious, and unclear. Further, the Sefer Bahir is one of the first texts to link the idea of various kinds of Hebrew letters and divine powers with the allegory of a kind of living tree, or a tree of life, with the limbs, trunk, roots, buds, leaves, and flowers representing various kinds of aspects of the divine world. Again, former scholars link this idea of the divine fullness, especially using the metaphor of a tree, back with the idea of the ancient Gnostic pleroma. Although again, this idea is heavily contested, and just exactly how the Sefer Bahir adopts and develops this idea, again, remains mysterious. Of course, the idea of the 10 Sephirot being arranged into the so-called Tree of Life configuration is going to become the dominant way in which the Sephirot are represented. However, we should use a bit of caution here. Many of the earliest configurations we have of the Sephirot don't actually list them as a tree of life, they rather list them as kind of nested one upon the other, a bit like Russian dolls. So it's important to note that in Kabbalistic texts, especially the Zohar, the Sephirot themselves are not fixed into one kind of configuration. They all exist in a kind of dynamic relationship with one another depending on the conditions within the Godhead, or even the conditions here on our world. And so the idea is that the position of the Sephirot can change depending on all kinds of factors. They're incredibly dynamic. It's only much later that the Sephirot becomes stabilized or standardized in the Tree of Life configuration such that they lose that kind of dynamism. Finally, the Sefer Bahir is also going to be very important in its account of theodicy, or the origin of evil. While in some sections of the text evil is simply part of the divine order of things, or perhaps even just pure negation, in those sections evil is a bit like cold and dark. It's simply the negation of heat and light. In that way, evil in those sections can be said to have no independent reality on its own. However, in adjacent sections, the Sefer Bahir comments on the nature of the primordial tohu vavohu, the desolation and chaos that seems to have pre-existed the physical realm in the book of Genesis. In the Sefer Bahir's commentary on those sections, it seems that the primordial desolation, or bohu, was filled only with peace, while the primordial tohu, or chaos, was filled only with evil. And it's there that we begin to get something like a dualistic theory of good and evil. Perhaps again, as earlier scholars have argued, this is emerging from a Gnostic context. But it's this very sharp distinction and interest in the nature of evil that's going to be incredibly important in later Kabbalistic developments. Again, indeed, this interest in primordial evil, and evil more generally, especially demonic evil, is going to dominate the imaginations of many Spanish Kabbalists, up to and including the development and composition of the Sefer Zohar. Given all these dramatic developments to be found in the Sefer Bahir, it's no wonder that this text is considered by most to be the foundational text of the Kabbalah as we know it. However, at around the same time that the Sefer Bahir appears, another theosophical school appears as well. This school is often referred to as the Contemplation Circle, or the Iyyun Circle, named after the central text that seemed to have emerged from this circle, the Sefer HaIyyun, or the Book of Contemplation. Exactly where this group originated is, you guessed it, mysterious. Gershom Scholem actually argued that they were an early 13th century group primarily in southern France, while more recent scholarship led by Mark Vernon has argued that they're a later 13th century group primarily located in Spain, probably in the Castile region. Regardless of the mysterious origins of the Iyyun Circle, about 30 works have survived in several manuscripts, indicating the popularity of those works. The works of the Iyyun Circle seem to represent a kind of theosophical Kabbalah independent of the idea of the 10 Sephirot as emanations of God. While the Sephirot do appear in some of the texts of the Iyyun Circle, they seem to be functioning much more like they did in the Sefer Yetzirah, as ontological principles of creation. The Sefer HaIyyun, or the Book of Contemplation, is attributed to a certain Rabbi Shammai and survives in several recensions, specifically a shorter and a longer recension. And in this text we have a very detailed, although obscure, description of the nature by which creation comes into being. What's perhaps most conspicuous about the Sefer HaIyyun is the exact number of divine powers that it enumerates. It enumerates 13 rather than 10. But this does make some sense if one considers that in classical rabbinical Judaism, God is thought to have 13 rather than 10 attributes. Of course, it's from the Sefer Yetzirah that this number 10, the 10 of the Sephirot, emerges. So here, in the rather enigmatic Sefer HaIyyun, we have another theosophical theory about the origin of the Olam, or reality. But rather than having 10, we have 13 divine powers. Of course, the Sefer HaIyyun is a very mysterious text and very difficult to understand, and the fact there are several different non-exact recensions also adds to the enigma and the mystery of that text. Another more endearingly popular text to emerge from the Iyyun Circle is the Ma'ayan HaChokmah, or the Fountain of Wisdom, allegedly revealed to Moses by angelic forces. This rather mysterious text deals with a wide range of mystical topics, including vowel vocalizations, the nature of the divine name, and the order of creation itself. And it positively abounds in images of light, fog, sparks, and ether. Indeed, one of the principal images this text invokes are the sparks thrown off by the blows of a blacksmith's hammer. That exact image will reappear in the Sefer Zohar as an explanation for the nature of evil, that evil itself is a kind of dross thrown off in the act of creation. Despite, or because of its enigmatic nature, the Fountain of Wisdom went on to become much more popular than the Sefer HaIyyun. In fact, it was necessary reading if you were to study under the famous Kabbalist Moshe Cordovero. And even the founder of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, spent more time teaching this text to his successor, Dov Ber of Mestritz, than any other mystical text. As we can see, this is a curious case in which the Fountain of Wisdom became more important and more influential than the central text of the Iyyun Circle. A final text that emerged from the Iyyun Circle that's worth mentioning here is the Perush Shem Shel Arba Otiyot, or the commentary on the four-letter name. In this curious text, we have the prophet Jeremiah studying the Sefer Yetzirah with his son over the course of 3 years, during which they make an artificial humanoid, the golem. It appears that after the golem is created, it becomes violent, as golems do, and Jeremiah's son destroys it. This text is fascinating because it's one of the 3 earliest to actually mention the animating property of the golem, the writing of Hashem Elohim Emet on the forehead of the entity. But by erasing the aleph of the word Emet, truth, it becomes met, or dead, and the golem simply dies. Along with the discussion of the creation and destruction of the golem, we also have a discussion of the 42-letter divine name to be found in the book of Genesis, along with some quotations from the Fountain of Wisdom. So the Iyyun Circle is very interesting for its combination of theosophy, although it uses 13 rather than 10 divine manifestations, and for the interjection of some degree of Kabbalistic magic into the early development of Kabbalah itself. As we've seen, the development of the Kabbalah is just that, a developmental story. with some strands barely surviving the first few centuries and many surviving even to this day. From the transition from rationalist philosophy to speculative theosophy to pure mystical insight, the Kabbalah is going to have various beginnings, middles, and ends. In our second episode of the exploration of the early Kabbalah, we'll turn our attention to the first true Kabbalist, Rabbi Isaac the Blind, called Sagi Nahor in Aramaic, literally full of light. And then to the first great Kabbalistic systematizer, Rabbi Azrael of Gerona. And then to the circle of the Cohen brothers in Castile, whose exploration of evil remains some of the most shocking in the history of Judaism. And of course, it would be that region in Spain that would see the publication of the Sefer Zohar, or the Book of Radiance, the crown jewel of the Kabbalah. So stay tuned for the next episode. If you're interested in the history of Kabbalah, its influence, or Jewish magic, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica. These are all core content topics on our channel. And further, if you'd like to support my work of making free, accessible, and scholarly content on topics in esotericism, please consider supporting my work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. It's your contributions and support that make Esoterica possible. Thank you. As you probably know, the literature on Kabbalah is very uneven, and even when it is solid scholarship, can become very specialized very quickly. And I'll say that the single best volume in English for tackling topics in early Kabbalah is a volume by that name, Early Kabbalah, edited by Joseph Don and found in the Classics of Western Spirituality series. The whole series, in fact, is really wonderful as a balance between spiritual and academic research, and I will say that this volume is especially good, especially if you're interested in the development of Kabbalah. It has copious notes, there's a wonderful introduction. So this volume is a really great introduction to many of the texts that I've discussed in this episode and in the next episode, and it's just really worth having if you are a student of Kabbalah or interested in the development of Kabbalah. It's relatively inexpensive and very much worth having. Further, if you're interested in the Iyyun circle, you absolutely have to check out Mark Verman's edition, where he translates many of the texts to be found from that group. His translations are magnificent. He reproduces the original Hebrew text of various recensions, and the introduction and analysis are very, very solid. So again, if you're interested in the early Kabbalah, especially the Iyyun circle, you absolutely have to check out this text by Mark Verman. If you're interested in studying the Sefer Bahir, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is there is no standard academic edition with a critical apparatus of the Sefer Bahir. The good news is that R.E.A. Kaplan of blessed memory's translation of the Sefer Bahir is pretty reliable. Although I will give one caveat, it's in fact the exact same caveat I gave for his edition of the Sefer Yetzirah, and that is, R.E.A. Kaplan was a practicing Kabbalist, specifically in the Lurianic school of Kabbalah, and he interpolates a great deal of Lurianic ideas back into both the Sefer Yetzirah and into the Sefer Bahir. Of course, as we saw, that's a bit anachronistic because the Lurianic Kabbalah is primarily a 16th century, really a 17th century phenomenon, where the Sefer Bahir dates probably all the way back to at least the 12th century. So interpolating ideas from many centuries later back onto the Sefer Bahir, while Kabbalistically interesting, isn't academically rigorous. However, I will say that the translation of the Sefer Bahir in Kaplan's edition is relatively free of these kinds of interpolations. Those primarily occur in its commentary. What's also nice about the R.E.A. Kaplan edition is he does provide an edition of the Hebrew text at the very end, although it lacks a lot of the traditional commentary. So his edition is well worth picking up, it's relatively inexpensive, and it does give an English-speaking audience access to the Sefer Bahir, both in a good translation, and you can cross-reference the Hebrew there in the back of the text. Of course, the standard edition is in the Margaliot edition, which is interesting because it's actually bound with the Tikkunei Zohar, which reveals something interesting about the history of scholarship on Kabbalah. It was in fact Gershom Scholem who was the first scholar to truly recognize that the Sefer Bahir was as early as it was, and was in fact the first text that disseminated Kabbalistic ideas, despite the fact in traditional editions the Sefer Bahir is thought to be later and is actually attached here in the standard edition to the Tikkunei Zohar and the Margaliot edition. At any rate, the Kaplan edition is perfectly fine, and if you want to get into the Sefer Bahir, that is going to be the entryway, especially if you primarily understand English. Well, we have at least another episode to cover before we get to the publication of the Sefer Zohar, so I hope you'll join me when that episode appears. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.